All right. Thank you for tuning in to this video, the best books we've read in 2020 so far. My name is Luke Spooner. I am a reader's advisor at the Prince George Public Library. And one of the favorite parts of my job is getting to talk to patrons and my coworkers about all the books I've read and hearing about all the new and interesting books they've read. But unfortunately, with the pandemic, I haven't been able to do that very much. So I thought it would be a good idea to bring in some of my brilliant colleagues and have a little bit of a discussion about the best books we've read so far this year. Not necessarily books published this year, but just the best books we've read this year. But before we get started, let's go around and introduce ourselves. Starting with Darcie.
Hi, I'm Darcie. I'm the community outreach librarian at the downtown branch, and sometimes I sneak up to the Nechako branch too.
Jeff.
Hi, my name is Jeff. I'm the digital literacy and instructional librarian, also known as Dr. Tech at the Prince George Public Library.
Hello, I'm Laura. I'm a reader's advisory assistant at the Bob Harkins branch of the Prince George Public Library.
Hello, I'm Leslie, and I am a library assistant in the Adult Services Department, and you usually find me at Bob Harkins.
Hello, my name is Patricia, and I am the Interlibrary Loans Librarian at Prince George Public Library.
Awesome, thank you everyone. So I will start with my recommendations, both of which I accessed on Overdrive as audiobooks. So I don't actually have the books with me, unfortunately, but they are great audiobooks. The first one is called Wow, No Thank You by Samantha Irby. It is a collection of essays about seemingly boring topics. So one is just all about her favorite songs. Another is about all the home renos that she didn't know that she had to do once she became a homeowner. And another one was just about how your body gets worse as you get older. But Samantha Irby is so smart and so irreverent with the way that she writes. I was cracking up the whole way through. And both of my picks are books that made me happy, which is something I really needed and still need right now. So that was kind of why they sparkle so much for me. So the first one, Wow, No Thank You by Samantha Irby. If you want to laugh, check that book out. The second one, and maybe it's recency bias because I just read it last week or finished it last week, but it's called Humankind, A Hopeful History. And so it's written by Rutger Bregman, and in it he presents a very controversial idea. And the whole book is kind of based around supporting that idea. And the very controversial, hotly disputed idea is that human beings are innately good. And so throughout the book, he takes examples from history and psychology of how humans are wired to actually be kind to one another, and which is why we've kind of been so successful. And at the same time, he also kind of comes for some of the hallmarks of the counter argument that human beings are innately selfish. So he comes for Lord of the Flies, he comes for the Stanford Prison Experiment, and it really made me, as a consummate pessimist, it really made me kind of rethink a lot of my own notions. So I highly recommend it. It lived up to the title. It made me feel very hopeful. And those are my two picks.
All right, so I've got my two picks here. So the first of the best books I've read in 2020 is the book Before I Was a Critic, I Was a Human Being. So this is a collection of creative nonfiction essays by Amy Fung. She's a writer, researcher, and curator. She was born in Hong Kong and spent her formative years in Edmonton, Alberta. The chapters about Edmonton were of particular interest to me because I went to grad school there, and I was familiar with many of the locations that she writes about in those chapters. So the galleries, the neighborhoods, and the high-level bridge. But they're definitely just as compelling for those who maybe aren't familiar with the city. The book has been described as a very long land acknowledgement. So her essays take us across the country as she writes about her experiences, not just in Edmonton, but other places like Montreal and the East Coast. She covers topics around the myth of multiculturalism, settler colonialism, and art. She shares her experiences with racism in the art community, in her relationships and with strangers. And she describes how her identity as an immigrant doesn't make her any less of a settler. So the art world has largely been untouchable by criticism, but she notes that more and more art galleries are filled with images and awards for Indigenous artists, essentially performative reconciliation, while galleries simultaneously exclude Indigenous bodies from their spaces. So I have a quotation about that topic from the book. In that moment, I felt closer to whiteness than not. I was completely complicit and didn't think twice about entering a space that could cover their walls with images of contemporary Indigenous perspectives, but exclude their physical bodies from entering and experiencing. In that moment, I felt like a real Canadian. So I highly recommend this book. It's very thought-provoking, and you can find it as an audiobook on Hoopla, which is one of our digital databases. It's narrated by Amy Fung, which I always love when it's the author. And yeah, so for my second choice, I picked The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy. So it's a beautiful graphic novel that was published in 2019. And actually my first pick was also published in 2019. So I selected this book because it affected me more deeply than anything else I've read in years. My favorite librarian, Patricia, read it before me, and she passed it along. And when she gave me the book, I opened it and just kind of started flipping through it. And then I actually just stopped and ended up reading it the entire way through in that moment. So thank you, Patricia. And so a review of this graphic novel on The Guardian's website shared that this book began as the author was working out his own struggling thoughts. And it started with a drawing he did of a horse confessing the bravest thing he's ever said, which was help. So the artwork is incredible and it's very dreamy. And I found that because of the way it was illustrated, it actually had the effect of really like quieting my heart and making me absorb the story more personally. You could even say I was being vulnerable while I read it. So there's, and kind of, you know, connecting a little bit to what Luke was saying about the Humankind book, there seems to be a lot of unkindness bombarding our news feeds lately. And the words in this book, I think, are the validation, the comfort, and the kindness that many of us really need right now. So I've included some of my favorite lines from the book. So this is the boy speaking to the horse. "Do you have any other advice?" asked the boy. "Don't measure how valuable you are by the way you were treated," said the horse. "What else?" asked the boy. "You will have plenty of critics," said the horse. "Don't be one of them." "Sometimes," said the horse, "you need to be reminded that it's courageous to have a soft heart, and you are spectacular because of it." So you can find some of the drawings from the book on Charlie Mackesy's Instagram. His handle is just his name. You can borrow this book from our library, and you can also find it in stock at local bookstores. So those are my picks. Thanks for listening. I hope you seek out and enjoy some of these titles we're sharing, and let us know what you think of them.
Wow, thank you, Darcie. I've got a couple of books here, not as descriptive as Darcie, but we've got here. My first one is George Takei's They Called Us Enemy. George Takei is now 83 years old, but in 1942, he was 4 years old and sent to a U.S. internment camp for Japanese people. A lot of those people were born in the United States, but were declared enemies of the state during World War II. He was in there for 3 years, 1942 to 45, and about 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast were interned. George Takei has always been a real inspiration for me. He played Mr. Sulu on Star Trek and all sorts of other things on TV and online. But this book, it's his story. It's drawn by Eisinger, Scott, and Becker, but it's his story, and it goes through the time he was in the internment camp, the time when they got out of the internment camp and were left with absolutely nothing. And it's really riveting, heartbreaking, and inspirational. So I definitely recommend that. It's a graphic novel, and it is in our graphic novel collection. On the more fluffier side, I've got here the latest Star Wars film novelization, The Rise of Skywalker. Now, a lot of people, this film was quite polarizing for Star Wars fans. So we got Star Trek and Star Wars fans here, but it was very polarizing. A lot of people hated the movie for various reasons. I just enjoy them. They're great stories. But the novelizations of the films, actually you get more information, you get more details. There's little gaps that get filled in and extra stuff. And it actually answered some questions for me. So, if you came away from the movie going, what the heck was that? The book may actually give you some closure. To me, Star Wars is always a lot of fun. And this book continues the legacy. So the George Takei was published in 2019, and Star Wars, of course, came out this year. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. It is my turn. Okay. So the first book I'm going to chat about is How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, The Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius by Donald Robertson. I listened to this book on Hoopla, and it is basically what it sounds like. So you can learn all about Stoicism by reading about Marcus Aurelius's life and his reign as a Roman emperor. Donald Robertson is a cognitive psychotherapist who explores Stoicism in a clear and relatable way. So you can learn a little about philosophy, you can learn a little bit about mindfulness, and you can learn a little bit about Marcus Aurelius. And that's that book. Okay. The next book is called Deep Light by Frances Hardinge. This is the book right here. And this is how it goes. In a world that salvages the remains of dead gods for profit, two young men attempt their own deep sea recovery mission and retrieve a god's beating heart. But fortune and fame aren't what Hark thought it would be, and he can't ignore how the god's heart is changing his friend. As their paths begin to diverge, Hark starts to question everything he thought he knew. This is a story about discovering who you are and finding the courage to stand up for what you believe in. Rated teen, starts Friday. It's not a movie, but it was released in 2019. It's lovely YA fantasy. I definitely recommend it. There is a character in there that's quite domineering, and there is some violence, so if you are sensitive to that, just be aware when you get into it, but definitely a huge recommend from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to hear your movie trailer voice in my head now every time I read a synopsis of a book. So my two books, they're both from 2019, and I did try to do screenshots my device because I don't have the phones anymore. So the first one I'm doing is Frying Plantain, and this is by Zalika Reed Benta. And this book is about a teenager, Kara Davis, who's growing up in Toronto, and she's trying to simultaneously navigate her friendships, the boys in her life, her family, and the push and pull of being Jamaican and being Canadian. This book is actually a series of short stories, and each story is a new section of Kara's life, from young teen to older teen or young adult. To be honest, I typically don't read a lot of short stories. I prefer novels, but I absolutely loved this book. And I think one of the reasons I loved it so much was because the author manages to write with the passion and the gravitas of literature without the heavy exposition of a novel. There's no need for the author to set up scene after scene. You know, the reader's just instantly transported there, and you basically just get to like the root of the emotions without having to describe everything else, all this extra, I was gonna call it extra icing that comes with novels. I found the most compelling part of this book to be Kara's relationships with her girlfriends, who are also dealing with their own balance of cultural identities within Toronto. But the real tension, I would say, is actually between Kara's grandmother, Kara's mother, and herself. So it's these 3 generations of Jamaican women who actually really struggle to communicate with each other and convey their values to each other. And they're each trying to influence the other to undo the mistakes of a previous generation. So it's very powerful. It's very interesting. I love books that are set in Canada and telling a Canadian experience that I have not had, and yet I can still relate to. Like, I've been to some of these neighborhoods in Toronto, or at least, you know, I can Google them and look up the images. So I really recommend Frying Plantain by Zalika Reed Benta. And my second book, it's also Canadian. Let's see if we can get this image in here. And it's called High School by Tegan and Sarah. And when I originally chose these books, I didn't realize until we actually started this recording that they're both about teenagers in high school in Canada. I just thought I was choosing one fiction and one nonfiction. So clearly I've been exploring some of my past. So anyway, High School, written by Tegan and Sarah Quinn. It's also from 2019. And I'm just going to ask you some questions to see if maybe you would find this book interesting. So did you ever walk to school in ripped jeans and a hoodie in -30 Canadian winter? Did you ever lie to your mom about doing drugs even after she promised she wouldn't be mad at you? Did you ever go to a party that you didn't want to go to just because you wanted to be cool? Did you ever date someone you didn't really like because you thought you were supposed to? Did you ever have a secret that you couldn't even admit to yourself? And finally, did you ever win a Battle of the Bands contest without any vocal or musical education while you were still in high school, which would ultimately lead to a record label signing you? While some of these experiences might not seem universal, but if any of them did, you will find much of your own teenage turmoil reflected in this memoir. In this memoir, Tegan and Sarah, who some of you may know already, they are award-winning musicians and LGBTQ icons, but they each write alternating chapters of their high school years as they grow up in Calgary during the peak of grunge and rave culture. What I found most fascinating was as Tegan and Sarah are grappling with their grades, their sexuality, their parents' divorce, it often reveals how often they felt alone and actually at odds with each other, despite the fact that they are twins. This memoir is also a unique perspective, I thought, on the concept of memory itself and how twins living an almost identical life could see themselves and each other so differently. So I found it fascinating, and again, it was another Canadian experience, and I just love that when somebody says high school, it's a high school that I understand and I went to. Because when I read American books or American television, I don't know what they're talking about when they say sophomore and junior. It's all nonsense to me. This is a book that uses grades, and you can actually identify with those people. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. You are all so nice. My choices aren't. So the one that you have to read is The Sister's Chase by Sarah Healy. It's available on Hoopla, and obviously you can get the library copy as well. So this is the story about Mary Chase and her little sister Hannah. And when their wayward mother dies at the beginning of the book in an accident, she bequeaths them the rundown family motel that they've been living in for years and years, very much so on the edge. Anyway, Mary finds out that the hotel, they owe more on it than it's worth, so she abandons it. So they take a road trip, and Mary's very good using her beauty to manipulate men along the way. I think of this as the Thelma and Louise for a younger generation. This book is a joyride. As soon as you start it, you won't put it down, and wow, does it take you for a ride. When you finish the book, you think, whoa, that's fabulous. You won't expect the ending at all. Why I love this book is because Mary, although she's beautiful, she defies the good girl trope. She is quite nasty. She's cunning. She's manipulative, but you have to admire her moxie. It's a great book. There's lots to discuss. I did it in book club. And again, The Sister's Chase. Brilliant book. Okay, my next book. It's not quite the thrill ride, but it's still good. So it's called The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek, and it's by Kim Michelle Richardson. This is the story. It blends two factual incidents in a fictitious way. It's 19-year-old Cassie Blewett is her nickname, Carter. It takes place in 1936 in Eastern Kentucky, and it's the story of the blue-skinned people of Kentucky, as well as the Pack Horse Women's Library. So the Pack Horse women would take, and it was mostly women, they would take horses with their library books and go into the back hills of Eastern Kentucky in between the years 1935 to 1943. This was a make-work project from the federal government to not only educate the people of Kentucky, but to help people through the Depression. So it employed more than 200 people and serviced over 100,000 residents of Eastern Kentucky. So not only did these women deliver library books to people, they also did reading lessons, and they also did read alouds to illiterate families. So it's quite fascinating. But this particular woman, Cassie is her name, she is one of the blue people of Kentucky. And this is the result of a recessive trait that leads to, oh brother, here we go, methemoglobinemia. So what it means is she has this light blue cast to her skin and her fingernails. But when she gets embarrassed or when she gets really stressed, she goes the color of a blueberry. The last known person in Kentucky that had this recessive trait was in 1976. But it's a great story that blends the two. Why it's interesting is because she's considered quote unquote colored in a very secular and segregated society. So the African American experience is her experience because she's considered colored. So with Jim Crow laws firmly in place, she too suffers what the African American people do living in Kentucky. It's a great read. I've done this one in book club as well. It's available on Hoopla, and we also have the book in our system. Thank you very much for listening to us. It was great.
Yes, thank you everyone for your book recommendations, and for anyone who tuned in, please in the comments share your best books that you've read in 2020. All right, bye-bye.